Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sean Armistead. I'm a Potterwoods Pathway man from South Australia, the land's there. I'm the Executive Director of Government and Public Relations at Indigenous Business Australia, and I'm your facilitator for this session. So I'd like to start today's session, Aboriginal Housing and Embedding Self-Determination, as our first speaker, but the title of our session here is Meeting the Housing Needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Households. Now, this morning it would have been fantastic to have Uncle Ringo Tarek as giving that welcome to country. Anyone who knows Uncle Ringo knows that when he gives his welcome to country and he tells his story, his dream always has in it a four-wheel drive, a tinny boat, and a house up at Lakes Entrance, and that's his dream on the journey that he's been on. I think that really is important to understand that housing is so much more than just four walls and a roof for many, many people, and I think everyone in this room knows that. So I'd like to acknowledge Uncle Ringo, and let's hope that he'll be all right. I know he's a close contact, but certainly acknowledging the country that we're on, the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nation, and to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present. I know that we've got people here from the Torres Strait Islands who have come down, so thank you, and from other states who have come across and come down here to Melbourne, to this wonderful land. So thank you for being present, and to everybody else as well. This session, as I said, is meeting the housing needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander households. We all know that the United Nations sees housing or homes as a human right, and it's more so with a narrow definition, that it's about living somewhere in suitable security, peace and dignity. Today's panellists are, as you know, experts in this area and have some really interesting insights to provide us. The landscape is changing and it is challenging. The panel, as I said, they will be examining the needs of First Nations people. There is a wonderful opportunity for everybody present to be able to send through, as well as those watching via live stream, to send through questions through to the panel. I'll run the panellists now, and I won't do an introduction between each one. I'll give an introduction, and then what will happen is each panellist will come up to give their presentation. So today's panel includes Matty Duggan, who is the Director of Aboriginal Housing at Homes Victoria, Dr. Megan Moskos of the University of Adelaide. We have Professor Tess currently at the University of Sydney, and finishing up will be Nattlie Smith, who's the Director of Policy and Evidence at Aboriginal Housing Office in New South Wales Government. So with that being said, please give your first round of applause to our first speaker, Matty Duggan.
Well, it's a bit bright up here. Just bear with us. Thank you for that, Sean. As Sean mentioned, so my name's Matty Duggan, so I'm the Director for Aboriginal Housing here in Victoria. I work at Homes Victoria for Department of Families, Department of Families, Fairness and Housing. Got to get used to that one. We keep changing our name pretty regularly. But before I go any further, I too want to also acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands of which we're meeting today. Also want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, elders that may be here in the audience here today. I'm a visitor to this country. I've been here for about 18 years now, working in Aboriginal affairs here in Victoria. I originally grew up in Darwin and moved down south to inspire other people and young people to become who they want to be as part of their dreams. And here I am today, standing in front of you. So today, really, what I'm here to display on you guys is a bit of a look in terms of what we're doing here in Victoria, particularly around the housing and homelessness space. And as our Honourable Minister mentioned this morning, there's a lot of work happening in this space for Aboriginal communities here in Victoria, and more importantly, it's a kick-start to where we want to get to support Aboriginal communities to really self-determine their needs, aspirations, and really get the housing on track to where it needs to be. So the reason I've put this slide up here today, so what is Aboriginal self-determination? Now, as you can see there from the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Human Indigenous People, it's pretty clear in terms of what that means. However, from an individual perspective, so as an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander man myself, it's interesting working in government to see how this has actually transpired over the coming years in terms of what is Aboriginal self-determination from a government's point of view, but more importantly, how do we inspire and really drive and embed and empower Aboriginal people to self-determine their own affairs, to ensure that they're getting the needs and supports for their own people and communities. So how does government operate within an environment of Aboriginal self-determination? So government has done a lot of work over the coming years, and a lot of engagement with Aboriginal communities. And when we talk about engagement, it's not like this engagement where you go out, you retrieve the information, you go back and you make your decision, you create your policies that basically meet the government of the day. This is really a changing of the tide, and for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people working in government in particular, we're starting to see the benefits of this coming through, and in particular, the ability for Aboriginal community to really be empowered to sit at the same table as government, to make decisions on behalf of their communities, on behalf of their people, to make the difference that's happening in these lives of individuals. So as I mentioned earlier, the paradigm shift, as I call it, where government's transfer of power back to community has been an interesting journey. And obviously from a Homes Victoria's point of view, we're seeing this really unfold in front of our eyes on a daily basis, where we're looking to improve our engagement and our empowerment of Aboriginal communities as we strive to achieve better outcomes for Aboriginal communities in housing, and more importantly, as you heard today, address some of the homelessness issues that are quite astounding here in Victoria for Aboriginal communities. It's important to understand that, when we're talking about this space, the shift in terms of the paradigm, as I discussed, it is something that we've seen with Aboriginal communities. Over time, it's that muscle you haven't flexed for a while, and it's about how do you grow and support that. It's not about just bestowing those powers and strengths to those communities without supporting them. And so with that, it's important that government sits with community, understands the expertise and knowledge, and more importantly, is guided in the direction that allows communities to then be empowered to self-determine, and more importantly, have the ability and empowerment to sit at the table. So one of the key leading pieces of work that we're doing here in Victoria, and this has been led through the work of in partnership and true partnership with Aboriginal communities, is the work of the Manana Warranty Mata Kut. Now, what that is the Victorian Aboriginal Housing and Homelessness Framework. Now, this body of framework that's been created has been a unique one. I think for those who have been in Aboriginal affairs in Victoria for a long time now will understand that the way the policies have been developed and driven, it's been of interest, but at some times they don't necessarily land or hit their mark in terms of where communities' needs and aspirations are. Now, I may be a bit biased in terms of this one, but it's one of the major policies that I've seen here in Victoria, especially in Aboriginal affairs for housing and homelessness, that's really given the blueprint for not only government, but Aboriginal communities collectively to work together in terms of achieving some of the needs of Aboriginal communities. But more importantly, it's about taking that step towards Aboriginal self-determination, to look at empowering, but more importantly, listening to communities and giving communities the empowerment to actually do this work on the behalf of the community. So rather than government doing it all, government's got a key role to play. We're not shirking our responsibilities there, but it's more about community, because they know what's best for their community. They know their community better than government, and it's about how we do that together. So with that, it's an important piece of work that we've really encompassed and relished in terms of our ability to really create this true effort that's going to really make a difference, and we're already seeing a lot of that happen, particularly with government transferring its own stock. So we transferred over 1,400 properties to our leading provider here in Victoria, in Aboriginal Housing Victoria, to really own and manage and support Aboriginal communities to live in homes where they feel safe and supported. Now that has really been the catalyst to really drive this series of change and empowerment back to communities. Now, what's important to note that with the Aboriginal Housing and Homelessness Framework, what it does, it not only gives us the ability to understand the continuum. So when I say about continuum, what I'm talking about is from homelessness right to owning your own home. It offers the opportunity for us to actually unpack that and work with communities to get some strategic direction, some strategic reform that really changes the lives of Aboriginal Victorians. And so we're seeing the benefits of that through a number of key programs, which I'll go into shortly. So through Manana Warnti Mata Kut, obviously with that, you've got to have a really good, strong governance arrangements, and more importantly, the empowerment back to community around supporting them to really deliver this in a way that's better, better supporting their community, but more importantly, empowering them to do so. And so through that, we've got a number of set of key governance arrangements in that to support the ability for us to do that. Now, Aboriginal communities here in Victoria are, far and wide. They've got different varieties of needs and aspirations and supports, and from a rural setting to an urban setting, it's very, very different from different parts of the state and territories here and outside of across our beautiful nation. But in Victoria, there's some real interesting attributes to that in terms of what happens in regional Victoria versus what happens in Melbourne Metro Victoria. We're seeing this huge shift in terms of communities really buying into the process, and that's something that, again, these governance arrangements are really supporting. So we've got, traditional owner groups sitting at the table, we've got Aboriginal community controlled organisations sitting at the table, and we've got government. And so with that, concoction and that mix, it's really creating us the formula to really start to address these in a meaningful manner. So as I mentioned earlier, some of the key strategic directions that have come out of the strategy is about supporting and increasing housing. And as Honourable Richard Wynne mentioned this morning, the $5.3 billion in the big housing build has been one of those key contributors. Now, 10% of that total net is going towards Aboriginal Victorians. So it's the largest investment of its kind. And so with that becomes a huge responsibility, not only for government to really deliver on that, but also community. So those community organisations and those groups that are sitting around that table, it's about us collectively really getting the right result. Because as you all sitting here going, wow, that's a huge opportunity. And more importantly, this could be the last opportunity we may get of this significance. So we've really got to take that opportunity by the horns, as I say, and really think about this in a way that benefits community, but more importantly, empowers community to own and manage their own properties moving forward. So as we suggested, that 820 dwelling target as part of that 10%, we're going to see some properties that are going to be right across the state, so 25% target that's across regional Victoria, and that will probably increase, noting the needs of Aboriginal communities is quite significant out in regional Victoria. But also with that, what we'll see is an increase of Aboriginal community-controlled organisations and traditional owner groups stepping into this space, which they've probably never done in the past. And so that comes the ability for them to really shape themselves and their organisations, and more importantly, their communities, in a way that they can better support their needs. So one of the elements of the delivery of the big housing build in particular was the fact of the matter that we've got a new system or a new Aboriginal housing system that we're needing to grow. So one of the approaches that we looked from the get-go was understanding, okay, what are the needs of the Aboriginal housing sector? And it's important to understand that given the large number of organisations operating here in Victoria, it was something that we had to identify pretty quickly about what are the needs of these organisations, and more importantly, what are the current skills and capabilities and strengths of these organisations to move them into this next realm of operating. And so through that, we made a very clear decision at Homes Victoria and with community and with government to say, without the delivery of the big housing build, we need to ensure that Aboriginal communities are supported, not only to participate in this work and leverage off this opportunity, but more importantly, to grow. And so through that, we've created a number of system enablers to support this ability to deliver on this. And so there's a number of key elements that we've got out there at the moment. And I'm really pleased to say that right now we've got a round open as part of the big housing build. It's part of our major round for the delivery of the 820 target. It's called the Homes for Aboriginal Victorians round. And what we're seeing through that round is a different approach that we've adapted in order for us to really cover off those elements, as I mentioned. So really building capacity of the sector, creating a commissioning approach that allows Aboriginal communities to own and control their own stock, and more importantly, looking at the opportunities to create a procurement approach that allows organisations to take the time to grow and more importantly, understand the system capabilities and needs that they are required to become a successful housing provider for Aboriginal communities. And so through that, there's two particular elements in there I want to kind of cover off. And it's important for me to do this because, again, it gives you some context about what we're looking at here in Victoria. We're basically trying to create a whole new Aboriginal housing system. And with that, you need the supports. And so for us, it was a no-brainer. We made sure we had to put them in place pretty quickly. And so we've got the Community Partnership Development Officer role, which basically will go in and support Aboriginal organisations to really move into the space in a way that they feel supported, but more importantly, look at building partnerships with other providers. So when I say other providers, other community housing providers that have been in the game a long time, got some skin in there, understand the capabilities that are required to operate in the space, systems, and more importantly, how to support those organisations moving forward. So we're going to see some really important opportunities that are going to come about this particular resource, and that's going to really benefit us moving forward in the delivery of that particular round. The other element to this work, there's a number of Aboriginal organisations out there that are already delivering housing to their community. And so through that body of work, what we're wanting to do is really support these organisations to unpack what they're actually doing in a way that supports them, gives them strategic direction, and more importantly, gives them the ability to then step in to become a registered housing provider here in Victoria. And so it's through the feasibility study works that we're doing, where we have 8 Aboriginal organisations undertaking that work, and they are from large to medium to small organisations that span right across the state. So what we're hoping as an outcome of this result, not only those organisations will be able to participate directly through the big housing build, but more importantly, they'll become the new providers of what we're seeing as part of the new Aboriginal housing system here in Victoria. I think with all of that, and it was a really critical point that was raised this morning as well, you can create all these houses and create new homes for individuals, but a lot of these individuals are coming from different scenarios and situations where they need the additional support to support them through it. And so through that, there's a real fine element here to get that right. And so it's through the work of the Aboriginal Cultural Safety Framework that we're seeing this opportunity to not only support our mainstream housing sector, because obviously here in Victoria, a large percentage of the housing that's been delivered is delivered through mainstream providers. And it's about how do we then build their skills and capabilities to operate in a way that's culturally safe for Aboriginal communities to seek those supports and offerings through their service. But more importantly, thinking about giving control and choice for individuals. Not every Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person wants to work with an Aboriginal organisation. That's fine. That's self-determination. That's their choice. And so it's about how do we then systemise a system that caters for everyone's needs. And so again, the Cultural Safety Framework is a really important piece that we're seeing, and we've embedded it as part of our delivery of the big housing build as well, to ensure that as the process rolls through, that we've got the safeguards in place to ensure that this particular approach is sustained through the delivery, but post the delivery of the big housing bill. The other element to this particular piece is the work we're doing within Homes Victoria. Now, within government, and those who have worked in government and those sitting in the audience in government know these environments aren't necessarily conducive to the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And that's in terms from an employee perspective, but also working with Aboriginal organisations and, more importantly, creating policies and strategies that support Aboriginal communities. So Homes Victoria are embarking on a new journey of understanding what Aboriginal cultural safety is, but more importantly, building our capability in this space to really support our ability to deliver the right services, the right policies, the right support, the right reforms that meet the needs of community. So taking you back earlier where we're sitting around the table with community, talking to them, working with them directly, supporting them to get what's required as part of this space, we can't do that effectively without building our capability and understanding of what Aboriginal needs are. And so this is a huge body of work that we're embarking on now, and more importantly, it's going to really shape the way of the future of governments, and more importantly, the system that we're operating in and supporting. Look, that's the end of my presentation today. Look, but I suppose just to kind of leave you with a few parting shots, as I call it. I think it's important, this conversation today. We've got some, great expertise sitting on the panel today. I'm sure there's more expertise in the crowd. It's a really important piece for us. I know as an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander man, I'm very passionate about what I do, but more importantly, I know that there's a need that we've got to fix. And so together with community and governments working together with the system, there's no reason why we can't take that shift together. So thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks. Thank you. That was a great presentation, Matty. I'm really keen to hear more about what Homes Victoria are doing. Thanks for everyone to come today, and also for those joining online. What I want to do is actually start again by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands from which we're all meeting, joining this meeting from today, including those who are joining us online, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So the research that I'm going to present today is actually some research funded by Ahuri, entitled, I'll go to the next slide, sorry, What Works to Sustain Indigenous Tenancies in Australia. So it's, the research is actually hot off the press, as they say, only being released by Ahuri this morning, and was undertaken by myself, along with colleagues Dr. Linda Isherwood, Professor Emma Baker and Dr. Arne Farm from the University of Adelaide, and Professor Mike Dockery from Curtin University in Western Australia. The research was also supported by an advisory committee made up of representatives from state government housing departments and also Aboriginal housing organisations. So the research was motivated by the acknowledgement that Indigenous housing is an enduring policy issue in Australia. So the housing careers of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people are very different. Indigenous Australians have lower rates of home ownership, a greater reliance on rental accommodation and higher rates of homelessness. Previous research focusing on Indigenous tenancies has mainly looked at what contributes to poor tenancy outcomes among Indigenous people. We therefore know a lot about the barriers Indigenous people face in securing and maintaining a tenancy, but very little is known about what works or what contributes to successful tenancy outcomes. It's important to understand the factors that do contribute to successful tenancies, as not only they prevent tenancy failure and eviction, but they also contribute to positive tenancy outcomes such as improved health and wellbeing. So our research adopted a strength-based approach to understand what works for securing successful housing outcomes for Indigenous Australians. So the project was undertaken in two sequential stages and involved both qualitative and quantitative research methodologies. So stage one involved a synthesis of existing literature about what works to sustain tenancies, and also involved a review of tenancy initiatives operating across Australia. And finally, stage one comprised an analysis of national data sets. So stage two was informed by the results of stage one and involved undertaking case studies of 3 initiatives that were identified as being particularly successful in achieving positive housing outcomes for Indigenous Australians. So the case study approach included undertaking interviews with key stakeholders, including drivers of the initiatives, program employees and also tenants. So in total, around 52 interviews were conducted across the 3 case studies, and taken together, the research provides new insights into the definition and determinants of successful tenancies, but it also uncovers some of the factors and characteristics of initiatives that have been successful in securing positive tenancy outcomes for Indigenous people. So I'm going to start by reflecting on what the research was said around the definitions of a successful tenancy. So a successful tenancy was defined by referring to the property itself, its size and state of repair. It was also defined by reflecting on the location, whether it was located in a safe environment around, surrounded by family, and also the stability of the tenure. A tenancy was also considered successful if mutual obligation requirements regarding the property were being met by both the tenant and the landlord, and that tenants were adequately supported in their tenancy. But most frequently, a successful tenancy was one that was considered to be one that transcended simple housing outcomes and included health, social and intergenerational benefits for not only tenants but also their family members. And for some Indigenous people, this included having connections to traditional lands. So respondents also highlighted that the definition of success varied according to where a person was on the housing pathway or housing continuum, using Matty's terms. And for a person that has never owned their own had never had their own rental property or even their own bedroom, obtaining their first rental property was defined as being a success, whereas for others, home ownership was the marker of success. So these findings suggest that a one-size-fits-all approach to Indigenous housing policy and practice will be unsuccessful in supporting people to realise their housing aspirations. A variety of programs and policies supporting Indigenous people right across the housing spectrum is needed, right from exiting homelessness up until entering home ownership. And moreover, housing policies and programs need to be flexible and holistic, with different types of supports provided depending on the circumstances of the individual and the housing outcomes that they aspire. So the research also identified broad factors which determine whether or not a tenancy is successful, and these can be seen to operate at a systemic policy, program and tenant level. So the accessibility of affordable and appropriate housing was a key systemic level determinant of successful Indigenous housing. So respondents reported that a limited supply of housing led to increased competition and often resulted in increased pricing, which prohibited tenants entering the market. Respondents also reported that discrimination exists in the housing sector, which further reduced housing options. In addition, the housing that was available was often said to or described as being of poor quality, which diminished motivations to take care of the property or pay rent on time. And for many Indigenous families, a limited supply of larger households were reported to lead to overcrowding and place strain on the household. Policy factors were also central to successful housing outcomes for Indigenous people, including policy development options that support appropriate housing allocation and adoptions of rental models that promote positive tenancy outcomes. Tenancy support programs themselves were found to facilitate successful tenancies through assisting, in the first place, Indigenous people to obtain appropriate housing, providing tenancy education, resolving tenancy issues, and where appropriate, linking tenants to broader support services. And finally, several tenant factors were said to promote successful tenancies, including having good financial management skills, attention to home cleanliness and maintenance, and being a part of a well-functioning household. So we've seen that tenancy support programs are or were considered important to contribute to successful tenancies, and the research was able to uncover the characteristics common to support initiatives or successful initiatives. So these included having a flexible approach to service delivery to allow a program to respond to individual tenants' circumstances and needs, having experienced and dedicated program staff with the employment of local Indigenous workers particularly highlighted, having effective links with broader services to enable the provision of wraparound services to assist tenants with any underlying issues that may threaten their tenancy, ensuring that programs were delivered by Aboriginal controlled organisations or at least in partnership with them, empowering tenants through education about their rights and responsibilities, adopting an early intervention approach, and providing intensive and ongoing support with an outreach approach for hard-to-reach groups. So our research findings led us to the following recommendations. So the quality of existing stocks of social housing needs to be improved, and funding should be put in place to increase the future housing stocks. It's important that these processes be undertaken in consultation with Indigenous housing organisations to ensure that the supply of housing supply of future housing, will meet the cultural and familial needs of Indigenous households. And the greater availability of short-term accommodations, such as visitor and crisis accommodation, could reduce current pressures on housing and incidents of overcrowding. An understanding is required of both the broader policy levers that impact on housing outcomes, such as the broader economic environment, and also the impact of historical policies that adversely affect Indigenous people. So in particular, partnerships between government departments and Indigenous organisations are required to co-design policies and programs. Our research also suggests that improved housing allocation policies are needed so that Indigenous tenants have enhanced choice and are better able to access suitable properties in their preferred location. Given the ability of tenancy support programs to assist Indigenous tenants achieve positive housing outcomes, obviously the ongoing and adequate funding of these programs is important. In addition, the provision of wraparound services to provide additional supports to empower tenants and build their capacity to address broader issues that may threaten a tenancy are also required. So finally, I suppose our research suggests that there's numerous areas that could potentially be the focus of future interventions to improve Indigenous housing conditions and outcomes. And these can be seen to operate on the systemic policy, program and tenant level. But when planning potential policy and practice options, consideration should be given to the fact that some of these areas are more amenable to intervention than others. So, for example, policy and program factors are in the direct remit of policymakers and housing providers, and as such should be relatively easy to implement and would have immediate impact. In contrast, systemic factors such as those relating to housing affordability and availability will be challenging to tackle. They will require a coordinated approach and thus take a longer time to change. So the tenant level factors that have been shown to shape positive tenancy outcomes are largely personal factors that depend on an array of socio-demographic characteristics which may or may not be amenable to policy intervention. They do suggest, however, how to target policies and service deliveries most effectively and suggest that broader closing the gap measures are also important to enable Indigenous people to fully realise their housing aspirations. So thank you.
All right, thanks, Megan. Wow, that is bright. Okay, g'day. I'm Tess Lee. I'd also like to confirm my gratitude to the Wurundjeri, to the Larrakia of my also hometown of Darwin. In the future, I'm moving to British Columbia, so to the Sioux Okanagan. The endurance and the refusal of all these generations, and to make the statement that I think is part of the paper today, that decolonisation is a necessary part of the planet's habitability. I will wend that into this talk. It is a really swift overview of some research that I did also with Megan in partnership with Nanapa Health Council on their APY lands, with Housing SA, with Gunnedah Housing Corporation and with Health Habitat. The question that we were looking at was one of sustainability. And our research is really comprehensive. There's a very fulsome research report that goes with this. We looked at how the word sustainability is pretty much a vacuous word that's used to authorise more of the same. And we did a close analysis, a case study with Gunnedah Aboriginal Corporation, which absolutely confirms previous speakers about the importance of community-controlled organisations working with organisations such as the Aboriginal Housing Office to drive sensitive service delivery. But here I'm going to talk about two findings in particular. So those are just a quick skip through the broader report. The two things I want to talk about is the case evidence for proactive maintenance and our findings about climate change. So let's go to the case study. This case study was on the Anangu Pitandara Yankunit Jatjara lands, APY lands, and it was an analysis of this close partnership that's developed between the community-controlled sector and the South Australian housing area to drive planned maintenance. Planned maintenance sounds like one of the most boring things that I could ever talk about. I actually get quite passionate about it. The reason is that reactive maintenance is the norm, a complaints-based system where tenants have to be driven to the edge of their own wit and sanity to get anything done. So a planned system which does things before they break is really unusual. And what we documented in exquisite detail is the possibility of this is not only can happen in the most remote of circumstances, but it saves money for the government when you do it. So you switch from spending a ton of money on extravagant travel costs, for instance, and you pour all of that into a system of checks and reviews so that you can get on top of things before people are living with broken things. As a result of doing that, you can also spend the time to create employment opportunities, not gammon ones, but real roles that are respectful and meaningful, because you've got the time to develop partnerships and relationships and to really embed those into systems of trust. And on top of all of those great things that you can do, you can get responsive maintenance costs, those ones which are reacting to things that are broken, down as a cost factor 20 times less than what it would cost otherwise. So our big claim in this report is not only should it be done, but it can be done, and we've documented how and what are all the savings to be generated by doing so. So you fix things before they become small things, before they become big things. You find that the tenants, lo and behold, are much happier and they'll start to basically call on people passing by about the thing that's broken because they're not worried about losing their lease if they do so. All sorts of benefits can be derived. We go through, as I say, we go through that in a lot of detail in order to show against a common government refrain that planned repairs and maintenance are impossible because factors of remoteness, factors of cost, factors of difficulty, lack of money, etc., etc. But what we also found is that you can start to look at what are the common hardware failures. And on the APY lands, these include electrical failures, air conditioner malfunction and breakdown, damaged and broken doors and door handles, missing screen doors and windows, blocked toilets, septic tank corrosion, appliance failure, especially stoves. Hardware failures, which are because of the hardness of the water or the dusty, arid landscape and the presence of insects, rodents and other animals, domesticated and feral. Crowding always turns up, and it's associated, of course, with accelerated wear and tear. Importantly, all of those issues raise questions of design, and that's where we go to the next issue. If you were able to implement planned repair and maintenance of existing housing stock across Australia, would it be enough for what's coming in terms of climate change? Yes, some of you are already shaking your heads. That's right, spoiler alert, no, it's not going to be enough. So to test that proposition, we actually simulated the thermal housing performance of houses in the three main climate zones, zones 1, 3 and 4, where the bulk of regional and remote Aboriginal housing and discrete communities are located. That's what that map's showing you. And the verdict, it's hot and it's getting hotter. We mapped that. This is just showing you in a snapshot that summers are beginning earlier, they're lasting longer, and the intensity of the days that are sitting above 37 degrees, the days that are sitting above 37 degrees inside the house, that's getting longer too. So the existing housing stock struggles to provide affordable thermal comfort. But let's test that even further. Remember that I said some of the common faults were things like the doors and the windows and da-da-da-da. So under our modelling, we developed two types of a house, or actually one type of a house. One standard 3-bedroom house, the type that you would find in most circumstances with some add-ons and bits and bobs to make them look like they're different. But pretty much the similar construction types. We took that 3-bedroom house and we said, what would happen with that 3-bedroom house if you had 4 people living in the 3-bedroom house, 7 people, 11 people, ratcheted up to 16 people? If you could open the windows, if you couldn't open the windows, if you could open the windows partially or not at all, was there an air conditioner or were you relying on a swampy? Where was that air conditioner placed? Was it in one room or was it centrally distributed across the house? What happens to the energy costs in any of those scenarios? What climate zone are you in? Are you in the tropics? Are you in the arid area? Or are you in the, the sort of Moree area? And are we looking at current temperatures or what the IPCC modelling is at its most optimistic, and we're already past this threshold, 1.5 degrees of warming? What happens to all of that, put in a kaleidoscopic set of arrangements, if you improved this standard house according to our current recommendations, the construction standards for those climate zones, which, by the way, doesn't usually happen because retrofitting housing stock to meet current national standards just isn't invested in. But if you did that, would that be enough? And again, the answer is not really. So 366 simulations later, there are some gains to be made by retrofitting to meet current national standards, but those gains are not enough to ensure habitability and the security of those houses as forms of shelter for what we know, we cannot deny, what we know is going to be happening in regional and remote Australia on the front lines of climate change. Now, I have raced through this, but if you are interested, down the front here, there's a small pile of these things, infographics, which I've just put up there for you as well. There's 50 copies, and there's more on our website. And it summarises all of that research, and it can also take you to a website where you can put all those simulations into play yourself. You can ask those questions. If I put 16 people into this house and I can't open the windows, what happens? Am I in the tropics? Am I in an arid area? Am I in the hot warm belt, which is most of regional and remote Australia? This research tells us that the standards, even if we did apply them, and we certainly should have been in the past, we'd be in a better position now if we had been. But even if we did, they're not going to be sufficient. So it raises tremendous questions about what the designs should be in order to cope with the most optimistic of climate change scenarios at 1.5. What are the solutions? Well, there you go. I don't know. I'm a humble anthropologist. I did this work with a group of people because we thought there wasn't enough research on these questions. But we certainly think that Australia should step into this space and become the world experts on designing the solutions to these pressing questions of heat. What you find in the thermal comfort literature is it's mostly Northern Hemisphere dominated. So there's a lot of stuff about cold and mould. What to do about, the fact that you can't heat the houses all the time round. And those issues are sort of a problem for a lot of Australia that doesn't go away. I'm not going to say that it doesn't exist. But the more pressing issue is how are we going to deal with the fact that some places are going to be dealing with 50 degrees plus and not much difference between day and night? Is the idea that we all live in Tasmania? I mean, what's the plan? Is there a plan? Do we have houses underneath? Do we have 1.5 metres worth of insulation in the walls? I don't know. These are the questions. I invite you to look, to play with our interactive data set, to ask those questions of yourself and to start raising this as a research agenda. And that's me done. Thank you.
The light's a bit bright. Thank you. Oh gosh. Iridu Maraing, good day. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians on the land we stand on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to my elders past, present and emerging, and I'd like to extend these respects to the mob in the room here today, as well as virtually. My name is Nat Smith. I'm the Director for Policy and Evidence for the New South Wales Aboriginal Housing Office, or AHO for short. I'm a proud Wiradjuri woman from the centre of New South Wales, Condobolin, or Condo for short. And a big shout out to any Condo, Cara or Orange people in the room here today. Yes? I can see one. The AHO considers this a great opportunity to be here at the conference to gain a national perspective and to learn about housing innovations that are working for mob all across Australia. And it's been really great to hear from my fellow people. The unprecedented challenge of the COVID pandemic and the ongoing threat of climate change reinforces the need to share ideas, lessons and experiences across the borders. By learning together, we can deliver the best with mob wherever they call home. The First Nations project defines resilience as the capacity of mob to sustain cultural integrity in the context of contemporary society. And I think it's really important for all of us to remember, resilience is not something that is given to someone or by government or the broader society in order to fix so-called problems or deficits in either themselves or communities. Resilience comes from within us. It is anchored with our connection to our identity, cultural beliefs and knowledge, kinship, and to our communities. More broadly than this, resilience can be personal, family, or drawn from community or an organisation. When times are challenging, resilience is tested. And we have seen a great number of challenges these past years. We also recognise the importance of climate resilience as changing weather patterns further challenge our built environment. At the AHO, resilience has meant continuing to deliver for mob, providing high quality housing and housing services in the face of fire, floods, plagues and a pandemic. It also means staying true to our core values. It has meant that even in these unprecedented times, we have stayed true to our principles of self-determination, Aboriginal-led co-design and keeping culture at the centre of all that we do. How do we achieve this? The AHO works with Aboriginal people, families, organisations and communities across the whole housing spectrum. Through this talk, I will explore some examples that bring to life the AHO approach to delivering for resilient communities. One aspect of our work is supporting the most vulnerable families in our communities to build on their personal resilience, especially in times of crisis. AHO's Services Our Way program, or SO for short, is an Aboriginal-led frontline service that provides culturally responsive service coordination, support and capacity building for Aboriginal people and families. SO works in an individualised, trauma-informed and family-centric way, matching the need of mob to services support. To give a better idea of the work we do, I'd like to share the story of Mary. Mary has 4 children, all of whom have been the subject to domestic and family violence over the last 10 years. When Mary reached out to the AHO Service Our Way program, she lived in a run-down, pest-infested home. Mary's ex-partner had destroyed all of the furniture. Also, Mary's children were not going to school and she had limited kinship support as she lived far away from family. We worked with Mary to understand her needs. We first replaced the damaged household items and removed the pest infestation so the house was habitable. And Mary and her children were safe and secure. Following this, So worked with Mainstream Housing to advocate on behalf of Mary to move her closer to family. Mary was also supported to access victims counselling, Indigenous mental health services, family support services and a money care program. Mary has since been relocated closer to her family, her children are going to school, and she is accessing the supports she needs. This success was made possible by working with Mary, building her trust and finding the strength from within. It was also key to advocate for Mary with the mainstream housing provider, helping to ensure she could move nearer to her kinship supports that she needed. Stories like Mary's demonstrate the importance of a culturally appropriate approach, putting the person at the centre and supporting them to build on their own personal resilience to determine their future for themselves and their families and what success looks like for them. We believe that Aboriginal communities are best placed to identify their own need and design the solutions to that need. This is the philosophy that underpins AHO's local community demonstration sites, delivered through true Aboriginal-led co-design approach. Too often we see words like co-design, co-creation, human-centred design bandied about when what is actually happening is government-led with community organisations given little freedom. Our local community demonstration sites starts with an expression of interest open to Aboriginal organisations. The AHO then connects successful organisations with a consultancy of their choice to co-design the project. Crucially, these discussions always start with the question, what does co-design look like for you? An example of this is Gunnedagunya's Transitional Housing Program. Gunnedagunya is a well-established Aboriginal housing provider who applied to be part of the local community demonstration site pilot. They wanted to explore and better meet the needs of local Aboriginal people who were in crisis or at risk of homelessness. In partnership with AHO and using an Aboriginal-led co-design approach, the program designed aims to provide culturally appropriate support to resolve local Aboriginal people and families' housing needs as they overcome immediate social and economic challenges. By the end of the program, clients and their families are equipped to maintain sustainable housing, meet their financial obligations, and making progress around their personal wellbeing goals. During lockdown, they pivoted to deliver much of the casework over the phone, allowing them to continue to support people throughout the pandemic. Key achievements of the program so far includes our clients consistently paying rent and budgeting income, and for one client securing their first ever paid employment. These are examples of both improved personal resilience as well as Aboriginal organisations' resilience. Building on the theme of Aboriginal self-determination, the AHO is committed to supporting a strong and resilient Aboriginal community housing sector. The AHO is working to build the capacity and resilience of the sector with a focus on listening, self-determination, and empowering Aboriginal community housing providers, or ACHPs, to grow and thrive. Through sector visioning workshops, the sector self-identified 10 priority areas which guide the work of the AHO and our partners. One of these priority areas, property management transfers, is fundamental to the development of a resilient Aboriginal housing sector. Under the AHO's PMT program, 1,500 properties will be transferred from mainstream housing to ACHPs. The AHO has also funded the establishment of the Aboriginal Community Housing Industry Association, also known as ACHIA. ACHIA is the New South Wales Aboriginal housing peak body for ACHPs and is supporting capability uplift and the development of best practice in housing services for Aboriginal people. And I can see Lisa in the audience today. National registration is another vital element in securing sector resilience. Together, the AHO, ACHIA and the New South Wales Register of Community Housing has supported 30 ACHPs in New South Wales to achieve NRS registration. New South Wales currently has the highest number of NRS registered ACHPs in Australia. Achieving and maintaining the national registration underpins strong governance and is foundational for delivering quality tenancy services to Aboriginal people and families. Further, through an expression of interest process, the AHO identified 29 growth providers who will partner with the AHO to grow their businesses. Growth providers work with the AHO to agree on growth plans targeted at the self-determined need of that organisation. To date, the AHO has awarded over $270,000 in grants to support growth providers. Securing the viability of the Aboriginal community housing sector to deliver sustainable housing is a key resilience factor. Back in the good old days of 2019, can people remember 2019? I attended a Human Rights Award event. Jasmine Kavan, an Aboriginal woman from the NT, won one of those awards. And her words still resonate and keep me grounded in the work that I do at the AHO. And she said, living in overcrowded housing is very hard on everyone. As our young people grow, we need more housing that is healthy for us to live in and healthy to raise our kids in. Housing is a human right and we all deserve a decent place to live in. So I guess for us to really resonate with those words, housing that is healthy and well for us to live in. Across the globe, changing weather patterns are forcing house builders to respond to harsher and more variable climates, including Australia. Through our Listen and Yarn engagements, tenants told us that they were concerned about the climate, facing hotter summers, unpredictable weather, and higher energy bills. The AHO has been actively working to improve the climate resilience of our housing stock, including fitting solar panels to almost 5,000 AHO properties across New South Wales and reducing tenant power bills by on average 30 to 40%. Fitting air conditioning to almost 2,000 properties. We have also been innovating to support tenants in drought-stricken areas by installing 866 hydro panels across the state, with a further 181 scheduled for this financial year. Hydro panels use sunlight to draw moisture direct from the air and provide clean drinking water every day. In remote areas where water quality is poor, this could be a game changer. Our commitment to climate resilience, sustainable houses extends to all of our new builds. All new properties are built in line with the AHO's design guidelines that lays out ways that we can improve the design and functionality of our homes. The AHO takes extensive measures to ensure that all components of the house meet the challenges of local conditions. A great example of this is our innovation using cross-laminated timber, or CLT. CLT is a highly compact and fire-resistant with a ridged termite-resistant structure, excellent for high fire-prone areas like Moree and helpful for reducing life cycle costs. CLT also contributes less to climate change, using less energy and fossil fuel to manufacture than steel beams. The design of new builds also incorporates a high degree of cultural sustainability. Overcrowding is a long-standing issue with Aboriginal housing, as there is generally not enough space to cater for extended families. In response, the AHO with our new builds have made kitchens larger to support extended family and guests, created larger outdoor entertaining areas to extend the living space and improve connection with the outdoors, provided larger and additional bedrooms to improve health and hygiene, flexible multi-purpose spaces that can function as additional bedrooms, living or temporary accommodation for guests. Through our innovation in design and materials, alongside our solar, aircon and hydro panel programs, the AHO is achieving greater climate and wellbeing resilience for our tenants and communities. Before I end, I want to just quickly talk about the AHO Home Ownership Project. Our commitment to supporting Aboriginal people and families to be resilient moves beyond just surviving to thriving. In our Listen and Yarn engagements, over 90% of people we asked said owning their own home is important. Aboriginal people told us that home ownership increases their sense of security, safety and pride. Home ownership also makes families more financially resilient, able to build equity in a property and help break the cycle of intergenerational disadvantage. There is disparity in home ownership between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal families, with 42% of Aboriginal households in New South Wales owning, compared with 65% of non-Aboriginal households. This required action on our part. The AHO provides grants to New South Wales Aboriginal home buyers, $2,500 towards legal costs and up to $10,000 towards the deposit for a house. On top of this, our Aboriginal home ownership regional project officers walk alongside clients on their home ownership journey. Many of our clients are the first in their families ever to enter into home ownership. Our regional home ownership project officers demystify home buying, providing support and tips on budgeting, credit ratings, and looking for the home that meets the family's needs. The AHO Home Ownership Project has to date supported 57 Aboriginal families to own their own home, 25 of whom were existing social housing tenants. One of our clients was a husband and wife couple, Brad and Sandy. Brad was born with spina bifida and Sandy is his main carer. They lived in an AHO home with their daughter Kira. The AHO made significant modification to Brad and Sandy's home to meet Brad's needs and increase his independence. In 2019, Brad and Sandy approached us to buy their AHO property. They were given information and support, and in 2021, they applied for an AHO home ownership grant totaling $12,500. Between their own savings and the AHO grant, Brad and Sandy were able to buy their home, giving them the security for their future, but also their daughter's future. In conclusion, resilience crosses many domains: personal, community, organisational and climate. For Aboriginal people, resilience is entwined and indivisible from our identity, kinship, culture and community. Across all domains, we have been challenged by fires, changing weather patterns, a global pandemic, plus more. Improving housing resilience in the face of adversity requires a coordinated response across the housing spectrum. At the AHO, working with communities through a co-design approach and placing culture at the centre of all that we do has been the key to succeeding in these unprecedented times. Madang Guru, thank you.
Okay. Look, thank you very much. We're going to do the Q&A here from the seated positions, and I obviously want to thank each of our speakers for their fantastic presentations, ranging across a variety of areas. We've got questions that have come in. Of course, it's not too late to send more questions in. We've got the next sort of 15 to 20 minutes to delve into these for, I guess, a bit more of the general fun chit-chat. Look, the first question I've got here, the first question that I have here that I might hand to both the professor and the doctor, the question is, how do we encourage a shift to an early intervention approach in a resource-scarce environment, i.e. limited resources entirely taken up at the crisis end of the scale?
I think we should fund a research project on that. My immediate response is, when we present, it's all nice and neat. It's, in terms of our research findings, there's systemic level factors, policy, program and tenant level factors. But what we can't ever, I never am able to do this really effectively, is to show the interrelationship between each of these. And so whilst we say that an early interventionist approach is really important, that everything is constrained by the policy environment in which one operates and the funding that's available to you. So that's sort of my immediate response. It's not a perfect one. I don't have the answer.
I think part of it is the work that we did, which was to show that there are actually cost savings to be generated by moving it to that sort of proactive space rather than the reactive one. And if that can be not just socialised but embedded into those systematic approaches, the breakdowns within the sectors that are responsible for delivering maintenance can't be the breakdowns inside those systems, not just the breakdowns inside the houses. The breakdowns inside those bureaucratic structures, the lack of corporate memory, the constant sort of search for the around-the-corner time where they're going to have a perfect app which resolves all of those breakdowns within their own systems, the chronic underfunding which creates a legacy effect going forward which makes it feel like it's impossible to get on top of. That's why we documented a place which has arrested all of that, turned it around, and is demonstrably generating savings as a sort of proof that it's not just an ideal that researchers, call for and community call for, and plaintiffs have taken governments to court over, but it's actually practically doable. So I think the more that we can insist on that at multiple levels, how to do it, well, that's in the realm of politics and agitation and increasing our asks and our demands.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. To Matty and Nat, this one's, I guess, what more can government do to enhance and enable? I'll ask you this one. How do you deliver an Aboriginal co-design projects? Because people talk about it, right? It's one of those things. Yeah, co-design, and I think you said Nat, co-design and sustainable
co-creation, design.
It means nothing if it's not mob-led or heavily engaged. What's your view or vision of how that actually really comes about?
I think it's about enabling government and government workers to kind of let go a bit of what that control is and what the potential solution is. And I think it's about supporting communities. They know best what is needed for their communities, and we should just be facilitators in an Aboriginal-led co-design approach to enable them to kind of sift through all the bits and pieces to then design what they think will work for their communities. Too often we are so unsure about, they're going to ask for like $1,000 billion. And in reality, you will see such great resilience and strength coming from local people on looking to the strengths of their community and really designing a program that works for their communities, which is authentic and well for that community. And one of the things in our AHO's leading community demonstration sites with our contracts is we give IP cultural ownership back to the community organisation. We don't own the project is owned by the community.
Perfect. Matty?
Yeah, so look, just hopefully everyone can hear me. So just in terms of building on that point, I think it's an interesting time for government. I think moving, Aboriginal self-determination, as I mentioned in my presentation here in Victoria, it's really evolving really quickly, and we've got treaty negotiations going right now. So this new space we're operating in is entirely new for everyone, and particularly for government. And so I think it's just as important for government to understand what their role is in this space and in terms of enabling community. So when we talk about co-design and all the flip words we use about bringing community together to make what's right for them, it's about empowering, but also giving them the tools they need to understand and navigate their way through the system that we operate in. So I'll give you an example, budget build processes, as an example where, there's a fine line in terms of how much community can play up to a certain point before we hit that process of sending it up the chain for sign-off. Now, that is a clear example of where some of this shift, as I mentioned earlier, that paradigm shift in terms of empowerment needs to start to come into play. But again, it's about the community understanding those systems that we're operating in to then navigate them successfully.
Okay, Professor, you mentioned that you're going to be heading over to British Columbia. Right? Are there any, and for the entire panel, but leading with you, are there any international models, your research overseas, that you think potentially could be implemented here?
Well, a little bit premature because I'm not there yet. 8 weeks' time, ask me then. There's a yes and a no. So in my little foray so far, there's some depressing similarities between the struggles that First Nations organisations, not just First Nations, Métis and Inuit organisations face in trying to get their housing and infrastructure needs addressed. There's depressing similarity in the issues of maintenance and poor original design, these legacy effects. So I will insist on that because those legacies meet the contemporary turnaround that you're representing. but you can't wish away the poor stock that you're also inheriting, and that needs to sort of have tremendous investment to turn it around as well. So the pressure doesn't, it's partially answered by having more Indigenous hands at different lever points within policy, within organisations, at every level. But it's not just there. We also have to prioritise this as an area of investment. I'll be really interested to see whether the Canadians are doing that differently. So far, I'm just seeing the kind of the problem side being a shared field, but if there's news, by golly, I'll be bringing them back, don't you worry about that. I
remember my Auntie Peg de Haven, once said in the early 90s she went to Canada as part of that circuit. She came back and she said, look, same problems, different climate.
100%. That's what's depressing so far. Like, I've been reaching out and working already with some organisations and just seeing exactly that, but also seeing that they're working in the same sort of experimental spaces. What does it look like if we create our own actual models and designs for solar powered and heavily insulated in their case, but also probably heavily insulated in our cases too? I think that's underestimated. Designs that are actually affordable and that wire into it systems of kind of sweat equity, home ownership, and also owner build and so on kind of models. And dealing with the issue of freight and so on. I don't want to minimise those challenges though. I won't hog this space, but we've just had a little taste with COVID of just the minor disruption to shipping and the ramifications that that's had on the construction industry. With climate change, more of the same. So we really have to ramp up the sophistication of our analysis of how to deal with these problems.
Fantastic. I've got a question, Dr. Moskos. Does the research cover both remote and non-remote data, and if so, what were the similarities and differences?
Yeah, so the case studies that we chose purposefully to ensure that there was variability of location. So one, and I'm not going to divulge the case studies' names, but one operated in a very remote region in Western Australia, another operated in a regional centre, and another one was metropolitan based in an urban setting. And so what we were trying to do in selecting the case studies with such variability was actually to trying to hone in on the elements common across the three programs that were found to facilitate sustainable tenancies. So our programs were really, our research design was really geared towards looking at the commonalities rather than the differences. But we did acknowledge that remote areas have a number of issues in particular that they have to pay attention to. I mean, we've alluded to some of them today. Just the tyranny of distance, the scarcity of problems with recruiting workforces, things like that. So,
okay, yeah, perfect. Matty, here's one for you. How does the VA-HHF interact/contribute to closing the gap?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. So obviously the Closing the Gap initiative is, we're currently working through the process of revamping that now, and that's happening across each of the jurisdictions, and obviously that's part of it from New South Wales point of view, and a few other members in the crowd that I'm caught up with today, which was good to see them today. Look, in terms of the Victorian Aboriginal Housing and Homelessness Framework, the synergies from a jurisdictional level from here in Victoria are very similar. So, and again, coming back to the earlier points I raised today, government here in Victoria working really closely with the community. So everything that's pretty much gone into our jurisdictional plan in terms of our actions and delivery is married up with the Victorian Aboriginal Housing and Homelessness Framework. So there's nothing in there that hasn't already been addressed or identified by community in terms of their priorities and needs moving forward. So obviously, we're in the throes of implementing that stage. I think the challenge with the Closing the Gap space is really about resourcing. And again, as the earlier presenter said today, resourcing is everything. I know it's a difficult thing for us to manage at times from a government point of view, but I think that's going to be the challenging side of our ability to implement that across particularly in Victoria anyway. So.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if many, I think people would be, but aware enough of just how groundbreaking the work that's happening in Victoria with the treaty process is, like the commission and everything. I just think it's amazing. I've got friends working on it, and hats off to them. They're doing a brilliant job, and the Victorian government leading and being part of that. I shouldn't say leading. The Victorian job facilitating it and walking together with it.
Yeah, look, it's groundbreaking, and you know, for what we're seeing from a government point of view, it's enabling us to actually think differently in terms of how we work with communities, but more importantly, how do we operate in this new environment? You know, and again, this is all new again, so you know, everyone's learning at the same space, even community. You know, and it's interesting. Similar to you, Sean, I've got individuals that are involved in that space, and it's this evolving opportunity, really, that's unearthing in itself. And you know, hats off to Victorian government to really enabling that process, because it is going to set, hopefully, the catalyst for other states and territories to follow suit. And you know, more importantly, what it does is allow Aboriginal people to be where they need to be in terms of driving the needs for their own people. So. Yeah,
I mean, a decade ago, you just wouldn't see it.
No.
It's a big ask. People want it, but you just would never see it happening. Nat, here's one. Doesn't self-determination mean public Indigenous housing should be transferred to community ownership, not just management? What are your thoughts on that?
What was the question?
Doesn't self-determination mean, it says public Indigenous housing, so Indigenous housing should be transferred to community ownership, not just management? What are your thoughts?
I guess, you know, to build the capacity of sustainable housing into the future, that of course would be ideal. That's a decision for New South Wales government, bigger than me, but absolutely to support self-determination of communities and the viability.
I've got one here, and we've got plenty of time. And there's another one that's just popped up for you, Nat, but I'll go to Tess first. I'll go to Tess, and then and it says, what is the one thing that would make the biggest change to ensure this is one of those ones. Habitability. There's certain letters that I trip on, W's and R's together, but you know what I mean, of regional and remote homes.
What's the single biggest factor that will increase the habitability of regional and remote homes? Oh, that's too unfair, because it's not one, it's not single.
I do like how they limit it one. What's the
one?
No,
don't do that to an academic. It's really not fair, whoever you are. It's not one, because it depends, and it depends on lots of things. Is water security your main issue? Or is your issue that you've got a big mining corporation that's just shifted your river and has polluted your environment, and you know there's now toxic tailings, you know, contaminating your DNA? Is that your biggest set of issues? And does your housing need to be part of that little ecology, that little big ecology? So, but if we're talking about habitability just in terms of the thermal performance of the house, if I can reduce it to one, then I'm not an expert, I'm not a design expert. Right now, I would say, you know, let's attend to something really simple like shading, you know, tree shading, canopy shading, and ripping up as much bitumen as possible. That's number one, but it's certainly not a full stop.
Okay, thanks. Megan, what more, because I'll direct this one to you because you talked about in your presentation about resilience, tenancies, was what more can government do to enhance/enable resilience in Aboriginal communities?
I think, is that Nat, the resilience?
Oh, okay, sorry, Nat, sorry, resilience, Nat.
Sorry.
Yeah, my apologies. What more, questions pop up and then move. What more can governments do to enhance or enable resilience in Aboriginal communities?
I think, you know, over the years, you know, lots of people have gone to cultural awareness training and, you know, people think they're culturally competent and all of that. And I think, you know, for us, it's around when no one else is in the room and a worker's interaction with mob, sometimes the horrendous language that sometimes I've heard workers use is appalling. So I think for me it's around enabling workers to actually be grounded and humbled in the sense of how would they like it if they were that vulnerable person. And I think that we shouldn't be in a room to monitor how people talk with people. And so I think for me around resilience is workers stripping off all of their, acknowledging their biases, but stripping off, their degrees and all of that, and a lot of that deep listening. And when you go out to community, every time you'll actually learn something yourself. And I think even for us mob, every year I'm learning something more about my culture, or I'm stripping back something that I thought I knew and it's different. And I think it's about that sense of reciprocity. You will get so much more by being in community, listening. And I guess, working in government, how can we as Aboriginal people make difference and challenge even within our own governments to enable that resilience for both programs and funding that support mob their way. We define success by, in one of my previous roles, we defined success as having a job. And, for some Aboriginal people, they said, well, that's not my success. My success is keeping my children and my family well. So I think that we've got to take off all these strips and labels of what we think every person should have a McDonald's. No, every person should be able to define what success looks like for them, whether they're, in social housing or aspiring for home ownership.
And that, and that definition can change for one person over time, depending on where they're situated.
And resilience is within a person. I hate when people go, oh, I'm going to help someone. No, you're supporting, you're assisting. Think of the language that you use around that.
Yeah. This is another question for you, Nat. There you go. Which is, what capacity exists for purchase of homes from existing lauks and providers for houses that have family history?
For lauks?
Yep.
I would have to take that question on notice because I don't know the answer right now.
No, definitely. I've got another one here. Things need to go beyond retaining Aboriginal staff, and this is to the whole panel. Things need to go beyond retaining Aboriginal staff to ensuring Aboriginal staff have the opportunity to progress. More Aboriginal leaders in mainstream roles. So it's a bit of a statement, but could I get your thoughts or inputs on that? Start with yourself, Matty.
Yeah, look, it's a tricky one because I don't know other jurisdictions, but here in Victoria, there's this huge employment push to get Aboriginal people employed in various parts of government, but the stock is so low, so you're kind of pinching from each other, from each government agency. So I'll talk to my colleague at Justice and I've stolen one of their workers, or vice versa. And I think the challenge for this is about the next group coming through, and it's about how do we then ensure that there is a pathway point. We've got graduate programs, we've got yes trainee programs, we've got a whole range of gamut of ability of pathways into government, but there's this kind of gap between, and I think it's really important that we try and fix that, because what happens is you then get Aboriginal people like myself and Nat and others that are being in government. You get to that level of a senior level, and then you can't go above to that executive level, and I think that's the trick about understanding, okay, well, for instance, my role is, it's only been up and running for 13 months, and it's the first Aboriginal Housing Director role in Victoria. And so what has that then shown government, and more importantly the sector, to say, okay, we actually got Aboriginal people in there pushing the message of Aboriginal business in a way that's going to get the results that we want to get. So I think there's a kind of two, part of the spectrum is kind of getting people in, and then more importantly, strengthening the individuals that are in the system at the moment and elevating them to roles where they're more than capable of doing. So I think it's just giving people the opportunity.
Yeah, and I think there are a few executives, right? And so it is, and you've got a lot of grads. We've seen the rise of Indigenous representation at university growing across not just a few elements, but it's now spreading across different disciplines. And it is that pull-through part, that middle management into executive layer, and I think that's, so agreeing with you on that, that's what my sort of read of the scene, both state and federal, have been. Thoughts?
But I think also, and I can see a lot of mob here, sometimes we get pigeonholed. If you can write well and you're doing something really great in one space, and you say, hey, I'd love to be able to do that mainstream change management role, and they're like, oh no, but then I'll lose you.
Yeah.
And so they then give it to some other non-Aboriginal people. So I guess it's that sense of how do you enable the funnel of awesome Aboriginal people at all the different grades and sprinkled throughout, and also the bravery to support Aboriginal people to do mainstream roles, and the cultural safety that Matty talked about to enable to do mainstream. And sometimes when I've done some mainstream roles, I've been able to bring a sense of inclusiveness, or how about we think broader and different, and enabling programs to be more flexible and innovative.
Yeah.
I was just going to respond in relation to both of our researchers, actually. In terms of the case study research that we did of successful tenancy programs, they constantly had a battle of achieving or securing Indigenous employees and achieving their targets. And one way they were able to overcome that was actually put in place structures that facilitated the potential employment of the clients of the program. So a lot of instances, clients of the program that really embraced the supports provided, those wraparound supports, went on to enter at a low-level position, administrative position within the program, and then access further opportunities within the program. So I think it's about providing the opportunities, and they differ in different industries and occupations. And that was where I was thinking about the planned maintenance program that we looked at on the APY lands, where again this model was deemed to be best practice because they were achieving fantastic local employment opportunities. And why is because they respected, they had the person on the main contractor had such high levels of cultural awareness of how people operated on the lands, what may come up in employing local people to deliver these services, that maybe cultural business will take them off for periods of time, and having developed strategies to be able to incorporate that into their employment model, such as having a whole heap of people in standby. They also went above and beyond in providing and gathering the evidence needed to enter mainstream employment, gathering into the documentation that many people don't have. So there's lots of little things, and I think that I'd draw the person that answered that question to the research that presented by Tess, and there's a key area, there's a key chapter in that details the types of factors that facilitate local employment opportunities.
She just gave my answer.
Oh, there you go. Well, look, that actually probably brings us to the end of our session today. I certainly want to thank the Aboriginal Housing Office for supporting this session as well. That's something I didn't do at the top of the order, so my apologies there. And thank our guests. I think wonderful presentations, the Q&A. Thank you to the delegates for attending both here in person and online. But look, we're all very passionate about this space. For many of us, it's our lives. We live it. We have that lived experience. But, these sessions where we can talk about what are the impacts, what does the future look like, what are the successes, which you just spoke about then, and that there is probably a challenging but promising future, because we've got people in this very room, and as I said, online, who are working towards it. So with that, I'd probably like to close out this session thanking you, but of course a round of applause and thanking our presenters. Thank you. Cool.